Depending on the CD4 cell count, we can predict the OI, and knowledge of OI is necessary for proper management of uh, the patient. So this slide is very, very important. If you can pay attention to this, on the left side, on the y-axis, we have the CD4 counts, cell counts, which are gradually declining. As you can see, as we move on from 400, normally the CD4 counts are above 500. As we start moving from 400, below 400, we can see the number of opportunistic infections which start coming into the picture. We had studied last time herpes zoster, if you recall. We will have a look at it today also. So one of the earliest opportunistic infection which we see is herpes zoster, which comes at around a CD4 count of 400. Then oral candidiasis, which we had discussed last week. I have shown you a couple of pictures also of oral candidiasis. It comes at around a CD4 count cell of 300. So if you have a person with a CD4 cell count of 300, you can assume that he is at risk for developing oral candidiasis. The risk for herpes zoster will always be there as it falls, but newer opportunistic infections keep getting added to the list. So oral candidiasis at 300, and then as it further falls to around 200, we have this pneumocystis jirovecii and pneumocystis pneumonia, esophageal candidiasis. This oral candidiasis, it becomes extensive to involve the esophagus also. Then mucocutaneous herpes. At further fall of CD4 count to 100, we have toxoplasmosis. We'll discuss about this. Cryptococcosis, coccidioidomycosis. Then as it falls further, we have Mycobacterium avium, cytomegalovirus, cryptosporidium. So out of these, we will discuss 3 or 4 which are very important for us, and try to understand their clinical presentation, their management, and how we can, and their differential diagnosis. That's very, very. So what are the common OI which are seen in India? Tuberculosis remains at the top of the list, as we had seen in the last lecture also. Tuberculosis is always the top. In fact, every patient who is having tuberculosis, the policy is now that we should be screened for HIV. And every patient with HIV should always be screened for tuberculosis by asking him symptoms of cough, expectoration, fever, and getting a chest X-ray done if any of these symptoms are positive. Apart from that, there are other respiratory infections like streptococcal infections, Haemophilus influenza, staph, which are otherwise common in other persons also. But tuberculosis is much more common. These are bacterial infections which are listed on the left side. Then we have viral infections which consist of zoster, herpes, cytomegalovirus, human papillomavirus, JC virus. Fungal infections like candida, as we have already familiar with oral candidiasis, pneumocystis jirovecii, which was earlier called as pneumocystis carinii. So you may find it somewhere written as PCP, but it is now, the name has changed to pneumocystis jirovecii. So it is PJP. Cryptococcus, histoplasma, and then various kinds of parasites also. So how do we approach a patient with opportunistic infection? Clinical approach to OI depends purely on the symptom presentation. It could be any of the following in a single presentation or multiple symptoms. For example, it could be short duration fever. It could be fever of unknown origin, like fever for more than 3 weeks and routine investigations are normal. Fever with cough, lymphadenopathy with or without any other symptoms, diarrhea with or without other symptoms, headache, focal neurological signs. Focal neurological signs means, neurological sign means something like weakness, paralysis of the muscles, body parts, and which is affecting only one part of the body. That is called focal neurological signs. If it happens all over the body, it is called diffuse neurological signs. Skin and genital lesions. So out of these 8 or 9 symptoms, we could have any one, or we could have a combination of 2. Like we could have short duration fever with lymphadenopathy, we could have fever with diarrhea, we can have fever with headache, we can have headache with focal neurological signs, we can have just fever with skin and genital. So it could be any of these 7 or 8 group of symptoms, either single, individually, or in combination. So we first start with neurological OIs, because as physicians, this is the most challenging one and we will need to address it head on. So one of the most common presentation is patient presenting with persistent headache, which may be with or without the following symptoms, which is fever. So we can have fever, headache with fever, with, or we can have focal seizures with neurological deficit. Again, the focal seizure here means, seizures means what we commonly call as fits. So seizure is affecting only one part of the body or one half of the body is called as focal seizures. When it affects the whole, all four, both sides of the body, it is called a generalized seizure. So focal seizures with neurological deficit. Neurological deficit means again weakness. Signs of meningeal irritation, which could be neck rigidity, photophobia. Neck rigidity, photophobia means patient gets irritable on being exposed to light. Altered sensorium, patient is not maintaining normal senses. He's drowsy. He's not fully conscious. He's not talking. Confusion again means the patient, you're not able to communicate with the patient. He speaks irrelevant thing, or memory loss. So headache can be present with any of these following symptoms, or it may be just only headache. So you can have fever, headache with fever, headache with fever with focal generalized seizures, or meningeal irritation. You can have all of them together, or any combination. So whenever a patient of HIV positive who presents with any of these symptoms, we should be alerted to the possibility of a neurological OI. If we know that his CD4 count is also low, then the chances of him having OI are quite high. So what is the diagnostic approach to a patient with headache? So if headache is persistent and severe, we have to look for two important symptoms, whether there is fever, neck rigidity, or vomiting. Or another group of patients may have focal seizures. So if the patient has fever, neck rigidity, or vomitings, then the common differential diagnosis which we have to consider is meningitis. It's a kind of meningitis. Meningitis means where the infection is involving the meninges of the brain and the spinal cord. So what we have to do in such cases, if we find that the history is suggestive of headache and we have on examination fever, neck rigidity and symptoms of vomiting, we have to do a CSF examination. That is, we have to do a lumbar puncture, taking the fluid, CSF fluid from the lumbar portion of the spinal canal and analyze it for the total leukocyte count, differential leukocyte count. I hope you are familiar with these terms. Glucose, protein, CBNAT, which is a kind of nucleic acid amplification test for tuberculosis, India ink preparation, culture. You will all be taught this in microbiology, or you might have already been made it. Now, if there is another patient who has headache, but who doesn't have fever, neck rigidity, but he has focal seizures, as I said, focal seizures. So there the diagnostic approach will consist of doing a scan, a brain photograph in the form of a CT scan or an MRI, whichever is available. If it is normal, then we go on and do a lumbar puncture to rule out the possibility of meningitis. If it shows a ring enhancing lesion, I'll very shortly show you what a ring enhancing lesion looks like. We have to consider the diagnosis of toxoplasma, about which you must have already been taught. I think there was a lecture on toxoplasma, tuberculosis or lymphoma. So these are the kind of differential diagnosis in a patient of headache who presents with focal seizures, in which a CT scan is suggestive of a ring enhancing lesion. So these are the three things which we have to differentiate. So how do we manage these patients? We have to find out the causative organism wherever possible using specialized testing, treat the causative organism. This is a generalized kind of treatment, not a specific, which is common to all. And we and since the intracranial tension, which is intracranial pressure, which you must have been taught in physiology, it is raised because of this infection. So we have to reduce this with the use of mannitol, which is a osmotic diuretic, intravenous. You will be taught about it in pharmacology. Fluid restriction and other anti-edema measures, and treatment of seizures with anti-convulsant drugs. So how does the CSF analysis helps us? CSF analysis helps us by being able to differentiate between the four important causes. I think the first three are more important for us. Whether it is a cryptococcal meningitis, whether it is a tubercular meningitis, or it's a pneumococcal meningitis. In cryptococcal meningitis, the cells which are seen in the CSF are predominantly lymphocytes, which may sometimes be normal in numbers. The protein is elevated, the protein levels, and the sugar, the glucose level in the CSF is. So we do the cytology and the biochemistry of the CSF analysis, plus we do staining. Now, if the India ink preparation is positive, then that is suggestive of a cryptococcal infection. Or sometimes cultures can be ordered, which are helpful in antigen tests, and SDA culture can be helpful in differentiating cryptococcal meningitis. In tuberculosis, which is quite common, it's a predominantly lymphocytic, and the number of lymphocytes are quite high, starting from a few hundred, maybe 100 to 200 to maybe thousands also. Here the protein is elevated and sugar is low. It's the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. and basically the CSF nucleic acid amplification test, which is called as CDNAT. This is a test which is approved by the WHO, and it's a standard of care nowadays in all patients, more so in patients with HIV, to detect the presence of the nucleic acid amplification test to detect the presence of tubercle bacilli in this. Similarly, if it's a kind of pneumococcal presentation, then we have a predominantly neutrophilic presentation. Neutrophilic cells are there. So this gives a picture of a pyogenic meningitis. Here again, the protein is high, sugar is low, grams TNF. So you will see that it is basically the cells, what type of cell is predominant, and then the microbiological investigation, which helps in differentiating between these three important causes of patient with fever, headache, and meningitis-like presentation. In cryptococcal meningitis, it is the causative organism is basically Cryptococcus neoformans. It's the most common fungal infection, fungal meningitis in patients with AIDS. CD4 counts are usually less than 100 in these cases. So if you have a patient presenting whom you have diagnosed as uh, cryptococcal meningitis, you can safely assume, even if his CD4 count has not been done, you can assume that his CD4 count cell will be less than 100 cells per millimeter cube. And wherever you already know that the CD4 cell count is less than 100, and a patient is presenting with symptoms of meningitis, you should be very, very strongly alerted to the possibility that this may be a case of cryptococcal meningitis. So CD4 cell count, wherever available, will always guide you to the type of OI you are handling. Again, the symptoms are same: fever, headache, malaise, neck stiffness. Symptoms of encephalopathy, which include lethargy, patient is not able to move around, altered mentation, he talks irrelevant things, he is not able to answer to simple questions, he is kind of half conscious, half unconscious. You can very simply say that personality changes, he doesn't talk relevant things, he may lose memory, and then sometimes there may be pulmonary and skin lesions, of course. So this is the clinical features in which we have. It is like any other meningitis case. So how do we manage? And I've already told you the diagnostic criteria, that is the CSF analysis which we have to do. Now going on to the treatment criteria, the preferred option. Now before I start the treatment, I would like to tell you that if you read certain Western textbooks, you might find that this treatment which I am discussing you may be a little different in those cases. What I am telling you is the treatment which has been approved and recommended by the National AIDS organization, which is called as NACO in India, which is the main body which is responsible for providing care, which is responsible for doing all kinds of research, and it is the main body of Government of India Ministry of Health, which shares the guidelines with us and guides us in management of this. So all these treatment is not exactly the same as you will see in most of the Western textbooks, including your Harrison's and Davidson. So this is different. This is one which is recommended and the one which is practiced here in India. So preferred treatment is a short course, that is a 1 week induction regime, which consists of amphotericin B deoxycholate at the dose of 1 milligram per kg per day, and flucytosine at the dose of 100 milligram per day divided into milligram per kg per day divided into 4 doses per day. So you have to use two drugs. One is amphotericin B, which is in the form of an injection, 1 milligram per kg per day for 7 days, and flucytosine 100 milligram per kg per day oral divided into 4 doses per day. After this has been completed for 1 week, it is followed by 1 week of fluconazole, 1200 milligram per day for adults. These are all adult things which I am talking about. Pediatrics will be a little different. So whenever they teach you about it, so they will tell you what the doses are. Alternative options for induction, wherever amphotericin B is not tolerated or amphotericin B is not available, there is some kind of allergy. So options are, obviously it will not be as efficacious when we use amphotericin B, because amphotericin B is a drug of choice. It is the drug which has the best effect, but it is a toxic drug. It can sometimes lead to nephropathy. It can sometimes lead to electrolyte imbalance. So there we have alternatives. So alternatives are 2 weeks of fluconazole, that is 1200 milligram per day for adults, plus flucytosine at the same dose as is recommended in the induction course. Or you can have 2 weeks of amphotericin B 1 milligram per kg per day plus fluconazole. If flucytosine is not available, because flucytosine is not easily available in India, it is a little costly. It doesn't sometimes come in the hospital supplies. So for those cases, we give 2 weeks of amphotericin B. And so only if flucytosine is given with amphotericin B, we can give the short course 1 week regime. If flucytosine is not available, then it has to be a 2 week regime for amphotericin B and fluconazole. If amphotericin B is not available, then flucytosine and fluconazole are given for 2 weeks. This is the same simple formula. If both drugs are available, first choice drugs, then it's a 1 week course induction, and then followed by 1 week of fluconazole. So this is the induction therapy, how we start, and then consolidation. After the induction, we have a consolidation phase. That is after that initial 1 week of amphotericin B followed by fluconazole, we have to give a long-term therapy where we try to ensure that whatever bacteria, whatever fungus is remaining which has not been killed is destroyed by this drug. So there we give fluconazole 800 milligram daily for adults for 8 weeks following the induction phase. So after the 1 week or 2 week of induction phase, we have to 8 weeks of fluconazole 800 milligram daily as a consolidation phase. After consolidation phase, there is another phase which is called as maintenance or secondary prophylaxis. Secondary prophylaxis means we want to prevent a recurrent infection in patients. For that, we again use fluconazole at a lower dose of 200 milligram daily for adults for maintenance phase. So this will continue for a long time till either the patient's CD4 count cells improves or we find that the patient's viral load has reduced. So for all practical purposes, we should know the induction and the consolidation. The maintenance phase can be managed by doctors who are seeing the patients in the later phase of the disease. So there is induction phase, there is consolidation phase, and there is maintenance phase. Fluconazole is a primary drug for consolidation and maintenance. Amphotericin B and flucytosine are the drug of choice during the induction phase. Now we move on to the other drug, toxoplasmosis. I believe you had a lecture on toxoplasmosis today by microbiology department. So what is different in toxoplasmosis is that it presents as fever, headache, seizures, altered sensorium, and focal neurological signs are there. But what is important is that as we saw in the initial slide, that in this case, instead of presenting as meningitis-like picture, we have a multiple ring-enhancing lesions in the gray-white matter junction seen on the MRI of the patient. So this ring-enhancing lesions are seen either in the region of the commonly seen in the basal ganglia or the gray and white matter junction in the MRI or CT scan. ELISA for immunoglobulin G is positive in over 95% of patients. So ELISA is a very important diagnostic modality. Definitive diagnosis requires brain biopsy, which is very rarely done in our setups. So presumptive diagnosis is based on characteristic clinical presentation of fever, headache, seizures, altered sensorium, plus your MRI. So clinical features and MRI when combined will give us a diagnosis, and then the ELISA for confirming will give us the diagnosis of presumptive diagnosis of toxoplasma. And it is recommended that we should start the treatment on basis of the history, MRI findings, and if the antibody levels are available as soon as possible without delaying the treatment further. This I have tried to show you an MRI. I don't know how many of you will be. This is on the B screen. If you see, this is a normal MRI film of a patient. And this A on the left side, which you see, shows these small lesions which are known as the ring enhancing lesion. See, these are small rings which you are seeing just in these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this 6. There's a smaller here also. These are 6 ring enhancing. This is how an MRI of toxoplasmosis looks like. But as I said, there are other conditions also which can present like this, which includes tuberculosis, lymphoma. So the antibody testing will always help us in making the correct diagnosis of this patient. So you will be shown these films later on as you move into the final layer. But this is just to give you a view that what an ring enhancing lesion looks like in an MRI. So what is the treatment for this? We have preferred regimen is pyrimethamine 200 milligram orally as first dose, followed by uh, dose-based regimen on the basis of body weight. If the 200 milligram as first is given in all patients, then if the body weight is less than 60 kg, then between 50 milligram daily plus sulfarizine 1000 milligrams daily plus leucovorin and 25 orally. Leucovorin is given to protect the bone marrow. So suppress the bone marrow. All these will be taught to you in pharmacology. So you can just but body is more than 60, which is very rare with HIV that body weight will be more than 60. But still, options are there. We have to increase the dose of 50 to 75 and to 1500 milligrams 6 hourly. Plus, you go at say 20 milligrams. Pyrimethamine is the drug of choice. If we have, if it is available, it is not available, then we move on to the second choice. But a drug of choice, if you're asked for management of toxoplasmosis, is always pyrimethamine, 200 milligram as first dose, and then the second dose, and then further doses is uh, based on the weight of the patient, which could be if less than 60, then paramethamine and sulfadiazine combination along with leucovorin are given. If it is more than 60 kg, then 75 milligrams. So paramethamine as a first choice along with sulfadiazine are to be given. This is to be given daily. Alternative regimen, wherever it is not available, paramethamine is not available, then cotrimoxazole, which consists of trimethoprim 5 milligram per kg and sulfamethoxazole 25 milligram per kg orally are to be given twice a day, and or paramethamine combination plus clindamycin can be given if the patient is allergic to cotrimoxazole, because allergic to cotrimoxazole is quite common in patients with HIV positive cases. So paramethamine is a drug of first choice. If it is not available, patient is allergic, there's some problem, we use cotrimoxazole twice a day. If that is also not available or the patient has allergy, then paramethamine can be used along with clindamycin if there's a problem in use of sulfa drugs. So patient allergic to sulfa drugs, we use paramethamine and clindamycin combination. The total duration of treatment for acute infection is 6 weeks. So it means the paramethamine followed by the sulfadiazine or cotrimoxazole is given for a total of 6 weeks, monitoring the patients for any kind of side effects or any kind of reactions in the initial couple of weeks. Then, after the 6 weeks are over, we have to give maintenance therapy. The maintenance therapy is cotrimoxazole double strength tablet, one tablet daily. The treatment is stopped. This maintenance therapy is stopped and the patient remains asymptomatic, or and the CD4 counts are more than 200 cells per millimeter cube for more than 6 months. तो जब आपने पेशेंट को स्टार्ट कर दिया मेंटेनेंस थेरेपी और फिर आपने देखा पेशेंट का आप CD4 सेल काउंट मॉनिटर कर रहे हैं, पेशेंट सिम्टोमेटिक नहीं है, फ्री हो गया सिम्टम से, CD4 काउंट जब 200 से ज्यादा हो जाता है 6 महीने तक, at least for 6 months. It's not just one report of CD4 cell count. If you have 2 reports of CD4 cell counts with a gap of 6 months, which are more than 200, then we can stop this maintenance therapy of cotrimoxazole double strength, which is a maintenance therapy. So paramethamine and cotrimoxazole or sulfadiazine form the core of treatment of toxoplasmosis. Then coming on to the third opportunistic infection, as I said, it is Pneumocystis jirovecii, which was earlier called as Pneumocystis carinii. So Pneumocystis jirovecii presents as a form of pneumonia. So pneumonia means the infection of chest. So clinical presentation will be fever, dry cough, occasional mucus expectoration, incidence progressive dyspnea, which may be initially on exertion and then gradually it may be at rest also. So this is the kind of presentation you have in a patient with Pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. On examination, patient has tachypnea, which means patient has difficulty in breathing, his respiratory rate is increased. Disproportionate hypoxemia means you check the blood gases or the oxygen levels by saturation. You find that it is very, very low as compared to the symptoms. Cyanosis may be there in severe cases. On examination, we have very minimal findings. Only on good clinical examination, you will be able to appreciate presence of diffuse but minimal dry inspiratory crackles. Now, what is crackles? This we will tell you as you move on to the clinical examination. Unfortunately, clinical training is stopped these days, so there is somehow a mismatch between what we are teaching here. Ideally, there should have been a clinical case presentation going on side by side, which is not happening for obvious reasons. So you have to make do with whatever I'm telling you in this slide. So this is the clinical presentation of a patient. Now, how to assess the severity of the patients? Mild, moderate, and severe. The patient has cough and sweating and grade 1 to 2 dyspnea, then it is called mild. X-ray is normal or has minor pre-Haller markings. I'll show you an X-ray film. But if the dyspnea is grade 3 dyspnea means patient has dyspnea even while doing minimal exertion. Or X-ray is showing a bilateral interstitial shadowing, or the oxygen saturation is between 60 to 80. Then this is called as moderate phase. Most of the patients present in this moderate phase. And then if the fever persists, the dyspnea worsens to rest, that is called grade 4 dyspnea, where you have breathlessness even at rest, with cyanosis, extensive bilateral interstitial alveolar marking, and saturation is below 60. So symptoms, chest X-ray, and oxygen levels, all three will tell you the severity of the disease, whether it is mild, it is moderate, or severe. So if you just know the oxygen level is below 60, so you know it is a case of severe pneumocystis pneumonia. And the chest X-ray will obviously confirm the presence of these findings. So this is how you classify the assessment of Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. This again is a chest X-ray where I have tried to show you the mild and the severe cases. Here you can see this is the hyla. This is called the hyla of the lung. And here you can see certain markings. If you can see, this is not a normal X-ray, but you can see mild hylar markings, which are not in the form of a consolidation. But here you can see how much extensively the whole of the lung almost. There's no area of the lung which is spared by this interstitial. This is obviously a case of severe Pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. And this is a moderate case. This is not a mild because the X-ray has findings. This is a moderate. Here also you can find the X-ray showing interstitial markings. So this is how two different X-rays, two patient, different severity of disease will look like. So the moment you see this kind of X-ray on the right side, you know this patient is severely ill and he needs to be hospitalized for early treatment. Now treatment, what is the treatment for this? It is combination of trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, that is 4 containing 15 to 20 milligram per kg of trimethoprim in 3 to 4 divided doses, and that is which is equivalent to 2 to 3 tablets of cotrimazole DS, that is double strength cotrimazole. 2 tablets 3 times a day is to be given of cotrimazole DS. This is given for a total of 21 days. First few days of therapy are important because the degrading of the fungus can sometimes lead to worsening of the hypoxia. Along with that, in all patients in whom the saturation level, the oxygen levels are reduced, we have to use steroids. So along with cotrimazole double strength, 2 to 3 tablets, we have to use steroids. Oral in the form of prednisolone, which is at a dose of 40 milligram per twice a day for 5 days. 40 milligram OD followed by 40 milligram once a day for 5 days, and then 20 milligram per day for 11 days. So 5 days high dose, then coming to slightly lower dose, and then further slower dose for another 11 days. So steroid is very, very important in management of Pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. Without steroids, we cannot manage or any hospitalized patient. So this is very, very critical to assess the patient quickly and take a call on deciding giving steroids to the patient. Alternative regime in patients with sulfa allergy, where we can't give cotrimoxazole, we give oral trimethoprim only, not sulfamethoxazole, along with dapsone, 100 milligram per kg per day for 21 days. Pentamidine is another alternative for 21 days, which is given IV. Clindamycin 600 milligram IV 8 hourly or orally 300 milligram, 300 to 400 milligram 6 hourly in combination with primaquine, or atovaquone 750 milligram orally twice a day for 21 days. Usually we prefer using clindamycin, which is easily available in hospital setup, because plain trimethoprim is very difficult to procure these days. Clindamycin 600 milligram IV can be given 8 hourly in patients who are sick. And when they recover, we can shift them to oral dose of 300 to 400 milligram 6 hourly. Plus, along with the clindamycin, we give primaquine, which is a drug which is useful in patients with malaria, so malarial prophylaxis. So we have this kind of thing. And then we have to give cotrimoxazole prophylaxis, as the last line says. This is prevention of pneumocystis carinii. This is a very, very important thing, which is called as CPT, cotrimoxazole prophylaxis therapy. This is for prevention of kind of pneumocystis pneumonia in future. So we have to continue cotrimoxazole 1 tablet daily in patients who have already developed, who have recovered from pneumocystis carinii. So we have talked of primary drug, which is the cotrimoxazole, along with steroids. If cotrimoxazole is not available or there's allergy most of the time, we use clindamycin or pentamidine. And then for prophylaxis, we use again cotrimoxazole wherever the allergy part has been taken care of. Now, after these 2-3 important things which we have discussed, that is the pneumocystis, toxoplasmosis, and the cryptococcal, we move on to GI presentation, which is diarrhea in a patient with HIV. Diarrhea is a most frequent GI manifestation among PL-HIV. Some unique features may be there. Diarrhea may be due to multiple pathogens. Pathogens may be more invasive. Pathogens may be more resistant to treatment. Invasive means they may cause very rapidly. They may cause deterioration in the clinical condition of the patient. There may not be adequate response to routine therapy, and there is a high recurrence rate. These is the general some terms about diarrhea. So common pathogens which cause diarrhea, protozoa are the commonest: Isospora, Aeromonas, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, Cyclospora, Microsporia, Amoeba. You can see these initial 3-4 organisms are not the common organisms which we find in a person with normal immunity. These are specifically seen in patients with HIV. Bacteria, virus, and protozoa in the form of strongyloids. These are the common organisms which can cause diarrhea. Now, how do we approach? We treat empirically with cotrimoxazole or quinolones for the first few days. If there is no improvement, we treat with metronidazole for 7 days. Then cotrimoxazole, TS2 tablets, BID for 3 weeks, and ciprofloxacin 750 milligram. BID for a week as empirical regime is quite effective. So we, because all the investigations which we are doing, they will take some time for the reports to come, and the patient's clinical condition may be quite bad. So it has been advised that instead of waiting for the patient's reports to be available and his kind of confirmed diagnosis, we start with empirical treatment. This is called as empirical treatment. Empirical, where we assume the common organisms are there, and then we treat the patients. So that for the combination is cotrimoxazole along with ciprofloxacin. It may or may not be combined with metronidazole or albendazole, and then we continue with the investigation for the pathogen, which kind of pathogen is responsible, and then specific treatment for that pathogen can be. Now, as per the stool bacteroscopy, if we detect any ova or worms, we can give albendazole. If we have cysts of amoeba or giardia, metronidazole can be given. Special stains are done for cryptosporidia and microsporidia, so they can be treated accordingly. Obviously, we can discuss it later on. And if only pus cells and bacteria are seen, then plain antibiotics in the form of quinolones can be given. So this is the basic, like special stains and stool microscopy, which will help us in confirming the diagnosis. Again, wherever these things are not available or there's a delay, so we have to go by the empirical therapy most of the cases. This is a drug of choice for most of the organisms. I think I'll skip it because the pharmacology will be able to cover it. So we move on to the other condition, which is called as esophageal candidiasis. In the last lecture, we had talked about oral candidiasis. I showed you some pictures also of patients with mouth having the curdy lesions, white colored patches which are seen inside the oral cavity, which is called as oral candidiasis. Now this is esophageal candidiasis. The name suggests here the oral candidiasis is spread on to the esophagus. So what are the symptoms we expect? Symptoms obviously are that there is retrosternal pain. Retrosternal means there is pain around the chest, difficulty in breathing, swallowing, which is called as dysphagia, and odynophagia means there is pain while swallowing, which is called odynophagia. So whenever a patient of HIV positive presents with any of these symptoms, we should straight away suspect that he is having esophageal candidiasis. Diagnosis is always by endoscopy, where a tube is put inside the esophagus and then a biopsy is taken from there. So treatment consists of chlorotrimazole mouth paint locally 4 times a day, and if there is no response, which happens in most of the cases, we straight away start with fluconazole. So for all practical purposes, we give fluconazole in almost all patients with esophageal candidiasis, which is fluconazole 100 milligram per day for 7 to 14 days. And then if it is more extensive lesion, then we continue it for 200 milligram per day for 14 to 21 days. Or if the patient is not able to swallow the drug, and if available, then injectable fluconazole can be given for 72 hours, followed by oral tablets. So drug of choice is fluconazole. For mild cases, it is 100 milligram per day for 7 to 14 days. In severe cases, it is 200 milligram per day for 14 to 21 days. So drug of choice is esophageal candidiasis is this, and I'll try to show you. This is on the left, as you see, the oral candidiasis, which we had seen yesterday also. On the right, this is a endoscope which has been put inside the esophagus, and you can see the white colored similar curdy lesions seen on all whole of the esophagus. This is a top view of the esophagus, and you can see these white patches. These are all esophageal candidiasis. This is how a esophageal candidiasis will look like in a patient in whom an endoscopy has been done. Ocular manifestation in HIV, retinitis is most common. Just to complete the list, although this will be taught by ophthalmologists later on. Cytomegalovirus retinitis occurs in 50 to 70% of age patients, offering after the appearance of systemic features. Cytomegalovirus CMV retinitis, as it is called, is a very common, one of the commonest opportunity infection affecting the eye. To rule out CMV retinitis, fundoscopy is essential in all patients with PLHIV with CD4 count less than 100 cells per millimeter cube and cases presenting with persistent headache. Fundoscopy has to be done after dilatation of the pupil. All these things will be covered. But important to remember for now is CMV retinitis and CD4 cell count less than 100. This is when the CMV retinitis. The patient with CD4 cell count of 300 or 400, CMV retinitis will not be seen. It's only when the CD4 cell count falls below 100, then CMV retinitis becomes a problem. It may be asymptomatic in most of the cases because it is usually affects the central part of the retina later on. Peripheral visual defects may be seen. There may be decreased visual acuity, or they may present as scotoma or floaters. Obviously, these terms you're not still familiar with, but just to complete the thing. Treatment, I think I'll skip because that will be little. But just to complete the name, the drug which we use is called as gemcitabine, which is used intravitreal, which is given inside the eye by a special technique, plus gemcitabine. These are the two drugs which are used in combination, which gives the best response. Or we can have IV gemcitabine, 5 milligram per kg twice daily, along with oral gemcitabine. So these are the two drugs which are drug of choice. And again, we have a maintenance phase, which consists of gemcitabine, 400 milligram once a day. So drug of choice, gemcitabine in combination with gemcitabine. I'll skip this. I think this is not very important for us at this time. Now, genital ulcer, which is if it is a herpetic ulcer in a patient with HIV, the drug of choice is acyclovir. And if it is a non-genital skin lesion of herpes, as we had seen the lesions yesterday, acyclovir 800 milligram 5 times a day for 7 to 10 days, or alternatively valacyclovir 1000 milligram 3 times a day, along with some calamine lotion to protect the skin. So, drug of choice for genital ulcer is acyclovir at a dose of 400 milligram. But if it is a skin lesion, not affecting the genitalia, then the dose is slightly higher. It is 800 milligram 5 times a day for 7 to 10 days. The dose is lower for a genital ulcer, whereas for non-genital skin lesion, the dose is slightly higher. This is for the herpes, which we had studied in the last lecture. Now we come to the final conclusion. How do we prevent opportunistic infection in patients with HIV? We should have some method. The most effective and the best way of prevention of opportunistic infection is early initiation of antiretroviral therapy, that is ART. This is the cornerstone. In fact, one of the biggest advantages, the biggest plus point of giving early antiretroviral therapy is that it prevents the development of OI. Why? Because the ART leads to improvement in the CD4 counts. It improves the immune response of the body, and as the CD4 count rises, the chances of developing opportunistic infections becomes less. So the cornerstone of prevention of OI is early initiation of antiretroviral therapy, and it is the reason why nowadays the guidelines recommend that all patients with HIV diagnosis should be initiated on ART irrespective of the CD4 count on the diagnosis. तो CD4 सेंट काउंट कितना भी हो, पेशेंट को एंटीरेट्रोवायरल थेरेपी एकदम से स्टार्ट कर देना है अगर कोई कंट्राइंडिकेशन नहीं है. And the biggest reason to early initiation of ART is the prevention of opportunistic infection. Personal hygiene measures, obviously, because we catch most of the infections by air or by sexually transmitted pathways. Protramadol prophylaxis for patients with CD4 cell count which are less than 350. So whenever patient who has a CD4 cell count of less than 350, they should be offered protramadol prophylaxis for prevention of pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. TB preventive therapy. We have not touched upon it. Obviously, it will be a little difficult for you to understand, but this is something which is called as isoniazid prophylaxis therapy, in which patients who are at high risk of developing tuberculosis, means they have come into contact with a patient or they have recovered from tuberculosis or the CD4 cell count is very low, there we give plain only isoniazid as a prevention of TB. So it is called as insulin prophylaxis therapy, INH prophylaxis therapy, isoniazid prophylaxis therapy. So protramadol for pneumocystis, carinine, and INH for tuberculosis, early initiation of ART, and then last but not the least, vaccination against hepatitis B, because that protects the patient from development. Obviously, if the patient is hepatitis B negative, then we give vaccination for hepatitis B. So these are the points which we can take care to understand how we can prevent the OI. This concludes the today's lecture. I hope you will be able to retain some of it for your later on clinical phases. Obviously, whenever you come to our clinics or whenever you see patients, all these things will be repeated. So we'll be discussing a patient of suppose a pneumonia or pneumocystis or meningitis, or so we will always be discussing the management and the diagnosis part. Since we have to kind of match with what microbiology is teaching, so we have to. Earlier, this topic used to be taught in final year of BBS by the time the students had already reached the clinical stage. Now we are starting a little early. I hope you have been able to get a grasp of some of the important concepts, especially what are the common OIs, and the most important thing is this particular slide, which I would like to highlight once again, so that it shows you what kind of OIs to expect. You can take a click for this, but I think this is not available in any of your books. This is the most important slide. It shows you as gradually the CD4 cell count keeps on falling. This is the CD4 cell count which is falling down, and these are the various kind of OIs which we see in these patients. So as you go lower and lower, all the more complicated types of difficult to treat, difficult to manage, and difficult to diagnose cases, opportunistic infections come. Very difficult to diagnose these cases, very challenging, and difficult to manage also. These are relatively simple to manage. Herpes zoster, oral candidiasis, even pneumocystis can be managed quite easily. But as the CD4 cell count falls, you have more and more people coming with this thing. So if there are any questions, you can write it down. I'll try to answer. I know it's a little complicated topic at this stage for you, but still, I've tried to make it as simple as possible so that you can retain some of the important concepts. So whenever you come for the clinics, you'll have some idea of what we are dealing with. So any questions we can handle, we can just say goodbye. Okay, then I think we conclude this topic. Thank you very much for your attention. So I request all of you to please stay safe. Use your masks. Tell your family members also to keep using masks. Stay safe, stay home. Try to use whatever clinical material is being provided to you through this platform. To read your books regularly. I know we also miss your clinics, your presence in the clinics. But as soon as this thing settles, we'll be very, very keen to start. We are trying to, although we don't have any program at present, by which can teach you clinical medicine through this platform. That will require a lot of effort, and unfortunately, all our team is involved in patients of COVID. So we can't even think of 4 or 5 people sitting together and preparing a kind of clinical program for presentation through this platform, where we can show you some cases or some examination. This is out of question. As and when we find that there is some breathing space for us, faculty as well as our residents, we'll try and start some kind of clinical uh, classes or clinical teaching through this platform. Although it is not the ideal platform for clinical teaching, but still some amount of clinical teaching can be done. So let's hope that time comes early and we are able to start that early. Thank you very much.